The city of New York stretched below the 95th floor of the Atlas Tower, like a circuit board of infinite glittering possibilities, a universe of dreams and ambitions laid bare. Here, at the pinnacle, was Aura, a restaurant that existed less as a place to eat and more as a sanctuary for the gods of finance and power. The air itself seemed different, filtered and rarefied, smelling of old money, leather, and the subtle, earthy perfume of black truffles shaved over dishes that cost more than a month's rent. The ambient sound was a carefully curated hush, a symphony of muted conversations about mergers and acquisitions, punctuated only by the delicate, almost musical clinking of sterling silver against fine porcelain. Light did not simply illuminate the room, it cascaded from massive crystal chandeliers, each one a frozen constellation refracting the city's glow into a million tiny rainbows on the polished marble floors. The staff moved through this gilded space with a practiced invisibility, their black uniforms designed to blend into the shadows, their faces trained into masks of serene neutrality. They were ghosts in the machine of opulence, essential but unseen, their purpose to facilitate the seamless flow of power without ever drawing attention to themselves. This was a world built on a single unspoken rule: the people who served did not exist beyond their function. Among these specters of service was Alara Vance. To the casual observer, she was indistinguishable from the others, a model of quiet efficiency. Her movements were economical and precise, her posture perfect, her expression a placid and unreadable calm, as she refilled water glasses and cleared plates with a grace that belied the exhaustion settling deep in her bones. Her uniform, a simple but impeccably tailored black dress, served as a kind of armor, a cloak of anonymity that allowed her to navigate this world of titans undetected. But beneath this placid surface, a mind of formidable power was constantly at work, a mind honed in the hallowed ivy-covered halls of Georgetown law. As she placed a dish of seared scallops before a hedge fund manager, her brain was not focused on the delicate arrangement of the food, but was instead deconstructing the snippets of conversation she overheard, analyzing the legal vulnerabilities in a proposed merger, identifying the ethical fallacies in a corporate restructuring plan, and silently cataloging the hubris of men who believed their wealth made them infallible. She was a ghost with a photographic memory and an encyclopedic knowledge of corporate law, a weapon of immense potential gathering dust in a gilded cage. Her presence in this rarefied atmosphere was not a choice born of ambition but a penance born of love and tragedy. Every perfectly folded napkin, every polished wineglass was a small act of devotion to her father. Just 3 years ago, he had been a titan in his own right, a brilliant software engineer whose small tech startup was on the verge of changing the world. She could still vividly remember the light in his eyes when he spoke of his work, the passionate energy that filled their small home, the scent of solder and coffee that clung to his clothes. That light had been extinguished by a hostile takeover, a swift and brutal corporate raid that stripped his company of its assets, dissolved its employee pension plans, and left a trail of financial ruin. The stress of watching his life's work dismantled, of seeing his loyal employees cast aside, had triggered a massive stroke, leaving the brilliant mind that had once designed complex algorithms trapped inside a body that could barely function. Now he resided in a long-term care facility, a place whose sterile, antiseptic smell was the polar opposite of the vibrant chaos of his old workshop, and the crushing weight of his medical bills, totaling over $200,000 a year, rested squarely on Alara's shoulders. This job, this daily exercise and self-effacement, was the only way to keep him safe. Her legal career, once a source of immense pride and promise, now felt like a cruel joke, a set of skills utterly useless in her current reality. She had been the star of her class, the one her professors pointed to as a future leader in corporate ethics, a legal mind capable of seeing the intricate connections between law, finance, and morality. Now that same mind was occupied with memorizing the daily specials and ensuring the salt and pepper shakers were perfectly aligned. Yet, the training never truly left her. As she moved between tables, she saw not just diners but case studies. She saw the performative dominance of a CEO trying to impress his investors, the subtle tells of a junior partner lying about quarterly projections, the predatory language of a deal being structured to exploit loopholes in labor law. She was a silent witness in a courtroom of power, gathering evidence she knew she could never use, passing judgment on men who had no idea she was even qualified to have an opinion. The world of Aura was a constant, painful reminder of the world she had lost, and the world she was fighting to reclaim, one meager paycheck at a time. The delicate equilibrium of the evening shattered with the arrival of Julian Croft. He did not enter Aura, he conquered it. The carefully maintained hush of the restaurant seemed to curdle in his presence, the air growing thick and heavy. He was the heir to the Croft capital empire, a man who wore his inherited power like a bespoke suit, tailored to perfection and designed to intimidate. He moved with an impatient, predatory grace, his eyes sweeping the room not with appreciation, but with assessment, cataloging the value of everything and the worth of no one. He waved away the maitre d' with a dismissive flick of his wrist, his gaze already fixed on the best table in the house, the one reserved for his father, Sterling Croft, who followed a few paces behind. Sterling was the old lion, a figure of quiet, immense power, his face a mask of stoic control. Julian, by contrast, was the restless cub, all snarling aggression and desperate need to prove his own ferocity, a walking embodiment of the arrogance that believed wealth was a substitute for character. Alara felt a familiar coldness seep into her stomach as she watched him, a chilling recognition of the very breed of man who had destroyed her family. The stage is set for a confrontation that will change everything. We're about to travel to the heart of New York City, but first we'd love to know where this story is reaching you today. Comment your location below, and be sure to subscribe to join our community. This is a story you won't want to miss. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. We love seeing our global audience. And if you enjoy stories where justice is served, make sure you're subscribed. You're about to witness an incredible story of resilience. As we get started, drop your city or country in the comments. And if you're not subscribed yet, now is the perfect time to do it, so you're always here for stories like this. The incident began, as such things often do, with a mistake so minor it was almost imperceptible. A young waiter, new to the pressures of Aura, his hands trembling slightly as he served the Croft table, allowed a single drop of red wine to escape the bottle and land on the pristine white tablecloth. It was a tiny crimson blemish in a world of flawless perfection. For most patrons, it would have been a non-event, something to be ignored or dismissed with a gracious wave. But for Julian Croft, it was a personal affront, a tear in the fabric of the universe that revolved around him. His voice, sharp and cruel, cut through the restaurant's quiet ambiance like a shard of glass. He berated the young man not just for the spill, but for his very existence, mocking his incompetence, questioning his intelligence, and dissecting his presumed lack of future prospects with the surgical precision of a practiced bully. The waiter, a boy no older than 20, stood frozen, his face pale and his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and humiliation as Julian's verbal assault escalated, each word a calculated blow designed to break him in front of the most powerful people in the city. Alara watched from across the room, her heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. Every instinct, every piece of her rigorous training, screamed at her to remain invisible, to let the floor manager handle the situation, to simply melt back into the shadows. To intervene was to break the cardinal rule of her profession and risk the job that was her father's lifeline. But as Julian's voice dripped with a familiar, entitled contempt, she did not see a nervous young waiter. She saw her father, his face ashen as he read the legal notice of the takeover. She saw the faces of his employees, their lives upended by the casual cruelty of a man in an expensive suit. A cold, quiet fury began to solidify in her veins, a righteous anger that burned away her fear. It was a fury not of impulse, but of clarity. She could not stand by and watch another good person be broken by the arrogance of a Croft. With a deep, steadying breath, she began to move toward the table, her steps deliberate, and her purpose clear, a specter stepping out of the shadows and into the light. She arrived at the table as a phantom of calm professionalism. Her voice, when she spoke, was low and steady, a stark contrast to Julian's shrill tirade. She offered a sincere apology for the mishap and assured him the tablecloth would be replaced immediately, her words a practiced balm intended to de-escalate and diffuse. But Julian was not interested in solutions. He was high on the spectacle of his own power. He turned his venom on her, his eyes narrowing with disdain as he looked her up and down, dismissing her as nothing more than an obstacle. It was then he uttered the words, the classic refrain of the powerful and the insecure, each syllable dripping with condescension. "Do you have any idea who I am?" A sneer played on his lips as he leaned back, expecting her to crumble. In that moment, something shifted within Alara. His question, meant to intimidate her, instead triggered a cascade of memories and a surge of profound, unshakable resolve. Her mind flashed to the fine print of the hostile takeover documents, the brutal legalese that had been the death warrant for her father's company. It was in that instant, with the weight of her past and the fire of her intellect converging, that a calculated plan formed. Her hand, holding a tureen of creamy, hot tomato bisque she had been about to serve, gave the slightest, almost imperceptible tremor. The movement was a masterpiece of controlled chaos, a tiny, deliberate loss of balance that sent the bowl tipping in a graceful, devastating arc. The hot soup cascaded down the front of Julian Croft's $5,000 suit, painting a ruinous, steaming path of bright orange across the pristine fabric, a shocking and deeply personal violation of his immaculate world. For a moment that stretched into an eternity, the only sound in the opulent dining room was the soft, wet sizzle of tomato bisque soaking into the fine Italian wool of Julian Croft's suit. A collective, silent gasp seemed to ripple through the air, a wave of suspended disbelief among the titans of industry who witnessed the unthinkable violation. Forks and knives hovered over plates of meticulously arranged food. Conversations about global markets and hostile takeovers were frozen mid-sentence, and every eye in the room was fixed on the tableau of chaos at the Croft table. The vibrant orange of the soup was a shocking, almost violent splash of color against the monochromatic world of power and privilege, a stain not just on a suit, but on the very fabric of the established order. Julian Croft looked down at his chest, his mind struggling to process the sacrilege. His face, which had been a mask of cruel amusement moments before, cycled through a rapid progression of shock, confusion, and then a deep, volcanic rage that began to turn his complexion a shade of crimson that nearly matched the soup. The air grew thick with unspoken tension, every person in the room waiting for the eruption they knew was inevitable, the explosion of a man whose universe had just been tilted off its axis by a simple waitress. Alara stood perfectly still, a statue of serene composure amidst the brewing storm. The now empty tureen was still in her hand, held with a grip that was firm but not tight, a picture of professional poise. Inside her, however, a symphony of controlled reactions was playing out. Her heart did not race. Instead, it settled into a slow, powerful, and deliberate rhythm, like a war drum beating a steady advance. The coldness in her stomach, once a knot of anxiety, had solidified into a core of pure, unadulterated resolve. She felt a clarity she hadn't experienced in 3 long years, a sense of purpose that was as sharp and clean as a surgeon's scalpel. She registered the details around her with an almost supernatural acuity, the faint scent of basil and cream rising from Julian's ruined suit, the way the light from the chandelier caught the terrified glint in the young waiter's eye, the almost imperceptible tightening of Sterling Croft's jaw as he observed the scene, his expression an unreadable cipher of cold calculation. She had crossed a line from which there was no return, and in that knowledge she found not fear, but a profound and liberating sense of freedom. The ghost had finally decided to become a reckoning. Julian's sputtering began as a low growl, the sound of an engine failing to catch before it roars to life. His hands, previously resting in casual arrogance, clenched into white-knuckled fists on the table, rattling the fine china. The veins in his neck stood out like cords of steel as he slowly lifted his gaze from his soiled suit to Ilara's face. His eyes, small and dark, were burning with a fury so potent it seemed to suck the warmth from the air around him. When he finally spoke, his voice was not a shout, but a low, venomous hiss that carried more menace than any scream. He threatened to destroy her. He spoke of lawsuits that would strip her of everything she owned and ever would own, of using his influence to ensure she would never so much as bus a table in a back-alley diner again. He promised to make her name synonymous with incompetence and ruin, to bury her so deep in legal and financial trouble that she would forget the light of day. Each word was a carefully chosen weapon, designed to inflict maximum terror, to make her crumble and beg for a mercy he had no intention of granting. He was rebuilding his shattered dominance with the only tool he knew, brute force and the crushing power of his family name. Yet Ilara did not crumble. She did not flinch. She simply met his gaze, her own eyes clear and unwavering. As he paused to draw a ragged breath, preparing for his next volley of threats, she spoke. Her voice, in the charged silence, was not loud, but it possessed a quality of such profound calm and authority that it cut through his rage like a beam of light through smoke. It was a voice that did not belong to a waitress. It was the voice of a jurist, a scholar, a person who did not deal in threats but in facts. She began by addressing his intention to sue, her tone patient, as if explaining a simple concept to a difficult child. She informed him that under the New York City Hospitality Liability Act of 2011, Section 4, subsection B, the legal precedent for accidental spillage by service staff established a framework of shared responsibility, limiting the restaurant's liability to the direct cost of cleaning or replacement, provided no gross negligence could be proven. She pointed out that her immediate and sincere apology, offered before the incident, would be a matter of record for all witnesses present, making a claim of negligence exceptionally difficult to substantiate in any court of law. She then smoothly transitioned from defense to offense, her legal mind working with the effortless precision of a master craftsman. She continued, her voice maintaining its unnervingly placid tone, that his own actions prior to the spill were of far greater legal interest. She explained the concept of intentional infliction of emotional distress, a tort claim that could be leveled against him by the young waiter he had so viciously berated. She detailed how his sustained, public, and targeted verbal abuse, which included insults to the waiter's character and professional standing in front of his peers and patrons, met the criteria for behavior considered extreme and outrageous by the state's legal standards. She noted the dozens of witnesses who could attest to the nature of his tirade, creating a formidable body of evidence for any potential civil suit the young man might choose to file against him personally. The legal jargon flowed from her lips not as a desperate attempt to sound intelligent, but as her native language, a tool she wielded with an expertise that was both breathtaking and terrifying to behold. A hush had fallen over the surrounding tables. The patrons were no longer just watching a spectacle, they were witnessing a masterclass. Julian Croft, a man who moved markets with a single phone call, was being systematically and publicly dismantled by a woman in a service uniform. Ilara wasn't finished. She raised a single, delicate point about the nature of his threats against her. She calmly stated that his promise to use his influence to blacklist her from employment could be construed as tortious interference with prospective economic advantage. She explained that while he was free to express his displeasure to her current employer, a coordinated campaign to prevent her from gaining future employment was a malicious act with clear legal ramifications. She laid out the elements required to prove such a claim: the existence of a valid business relationship or expectancy, the defendant's knowledge of that expectancy, intentional interference, and resulting damages. And then, With a chillingly precise gaze, she implied that his very public declaration had already provided the first three elements. All that was left was for her to be fired, which would establish the fourth. Julian's face had lost all its color. The rage was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed, sputtering disbelief. He looked like a chess grandmaster who had just been checkmated in 3 moves by a child. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, no words coming out. The complex legal architecture she had constructed around him in less than a minute had left him trapped, his power rendered useless against the impenetrable fortress of her intellect. He looked to his father for support, for some sign of shared outrage, but Sterling Croft's face was a mask of cold, analytical curiosity. There was no anger in the old man's eyes, only a keen, piercing intelligence that seemed to be dissecting Ilara, weighing her, and measuring her worth. For the first time, perhaps in his entire pampered life, Julian Croft was completely and utterly alone, stripped bare of his authority, and exposed as a hollow tyrant in front of the very people he sought to impress. The humiliation was absolute, a silent, crushing weight that was far more damaging than any spilled soup. Finally finding his voice, Julian did the only thing he could. He reverted to the basest form of his power. He did not shout legal arguments, he shouted an order. With a face contorted in a mask of pure, impotent fury, he pointed a trembling finger at Ilara and screamed at the restaurant manager, who had been hovering nearby with a look of sheer panic on his face. The words were raw and guttural. Fire her now. It was a command born not of authority, but of desperation, the last resort of a king who had lost his kingdom and was now trying to save his crown by ordering an execution. The manager, a man caught between the wrath of a powerful client and the rules of his establishment, looked at Ilara with a pained, apologetic expression. He knew she was in the right. He knew Julian was the aggressor. But the unspoken rule of aura was absolute. The gods of finance were never to be displeased. With a quiet, defeated sigh, he nodded curtly at Ilara and gestured toward the service exit. Her employment at Aura was officially and unceremoniously terminated. As 2 security guards, their faces impassive, materialized to escort her from the dining room, Julian delivered his parting shot. His voice, now a low snarl, was meant only for her. He told her she had just made the biggest mistake of her life. He reiterated his promise that she was finished in New York, that the Croft name would be a permanent stain on her record, a ghost that would haunt any attempt she made to rebuild her life. He wanted her to leave not just unemployed, but broken and terrified. Ilara, however, felt neither. As she turned to walk away, she allowed herself the smallest, most fleeting glance back at him. She saw not a titan of industry, but a petulant, frightened boy who had been publicly outmatched and was now lashing out like a cornered animal. And in that moment, she felt a flicker of something she had not expected: pity. It was a fleeting emotion, quickly replaced by the cold, hard certainty of her new reality. She had lost her job, her only means of supporting her father. But she had found something far more valuable: her voice. The walk from the dining floor to the employee locker room was a blur of averted gazes and sympathetic whispers from her former colleagues. They knew an injustice had occurred, but they also knew the price of speaking out. She changed out of her uniform, the simple black dress that had been her cloak of invisibility, and into her worn street clothes. Each movement was deliberate, methodical. She felt a strange sense of detachment, as if she were watching a character in a movie. The shock had not yet settled in. It was held at bay by a surge of adrenaline and the lingering echo of her own empowered voice in the silent restaurant. She packed her few belongings into a small tote bag, her mind a blank slate, refusing to process the full implications of what had just happened. She was on autopilot, her body moving through the familiar motions of departure, while her spirit was still standing tall on the 95th floor, facing down a tyrant. The true emotional reckoning, she knew, was waiting for her outside the gilded cage of the Atlas Tower. Down on the street, The cold November air hit her like a physical blow, snapping her out of her daze. The roar of New York City traffic, the blare of horns, and the endless river of anonymous faces suddenly felt overwhelming, a chaotic contrast to the rarefied, controlled silence of Aura. She stood on the sidewalk, clutching her tote bag, the reality of her situation crashing down on her with the force of a physical impact. She was unemployed. She had no savings to speak of. Her father's next medical bill, a staggering sum of over $16,000 for the month, was due in 2 weeks. A wave of pure, undiluted panic washed over her, so intense it made her knees feel weak. Her breath hitched in her chest, and for a terrifying moment, she thought she might be sick right there on the pavement. The image of her father's face, pale and trusting in his hospital bed, flashed in her mind, and a profound sense of failure and despair threatened to swallow her whole. She had acted on principle, on a righteous impulse, but the consequences were real, and they were catastrophic. She began to walk, her destination unknown, her feet moving simply to put distance between herself and the gleaming tower that represented both her salvation and her ruin. The city lights blurred through the tears that now welled in her eyes, tears of frustration, of fear, of a grief that had been simmering just beneath the surface for 3 long years. She had sacrificed her dreams, her career, her very identity to keep her father safe, and in one reckless moment of defiance, she had jeopardized it all. The weight of her decision pressed down on her, each step heavier than the last. The world she had so carefully constructed, a fragile ecosystem of survival built on self-effacement and grueling hours, had been shattered. She was adrift in a city of millions, armed with a brilliant legal mind that was utterly useless for paying the bills of a long-term care facility. The despair was a physical entity, a cold, heavy cloak that wrapped itself around her, whispering of failure and hopelessness in the biting wind. But as she walked, another feeling began to surface, pushing its way through the thick fog of her fear. It was the memory of Julian Croft's face, the image of his arrogant sneer dissolving into stunned silence. It was the echo of her own voice, calm and precise, speaking the language of law and justice with an authority she had forgotten she possessed. For the first time since her father's collapse, she had not been a victim. She had not been a ghost. She had been a force. She had used the skills she had worked so hard to acquire, the intellect that was her birthright, and she had made a powerful man tremble. The act itself, though costly, had reignited a fire within her that she thought had been extinguished forever. The despair did not vanish, but it began to recede, burned back by the clean, hot flame of a newfound purpose. The anger she felt was no longer just a passive, sorrowful grief for what her family had lost. It was an active, focused, and energizing rage. She stopped walking, standing at the edge of a busy intersection, the traffic lights painting shifting patterns of red and green on her face. A decision began to form in her mind, a choice that was as terrifying as it was liberating. She would no longer play the part of the dutiful, invisible daughter, slowly drowning under the weight of a debt she did not create. She would no longer allow the men who had destroyed her father's life to exist in a world without consequences. The system had failed her family once. Its legal protections, nothing more than paper shields against the brute force of corporate greed. She would not make the mistake of trusting it again. If justice was to be had, she would have to seize it herself. In that moment, standing on a cold street corner in the heart of Manhattan, Alara Vance, the former waitress, made a silent vow. The fight was no longer about survival. It was about retribution. It was in that precise moment of crystallized resolve that a long, black sedan, its windows tinted to an impenetrable darkness, pulled up silently to the curb beside her. The car was a vision of understated power, its glossy finish reflecting the city lights like a pool of black ink. It was so out of place on this ordinary street corner that it seemed to have materialized out of thin air. Alara tensed, her street-honed instincts screaming at her to be wary. A man in a dark suit and a discreet earpiece emerged from the driver's seat. He did not look at her with aggression, but with a quiet, professional respect. He opened the rear passenger door and spoke, his voice a low, polite murmur that was almost lost in the city's noise. He said that Mr. Croft would like a word with her. The name sent a jolt through her, a mixture of alarm and morbid curiosity. She assumed it was some new form of harassment, a final, cruel twist of the knife from Julian. But a part of her, the newly awakened strategist, knew this was not Julian's style. This was quiet, efficient, and deliberate. This was the work of a different kind of power. She looked past the driver, into the shadowy interior of the car. She could just make out the silhouette of a man sitting inside, a figure of stillness and immense presence. She had nothing left to lose. Her job was gone, her future uncertain. Whatever this was, it could not be worse than the reality she was already facing. With a deep breath that did little to calm the sudden pounding of her heart, she made a decision. She gave the driver a single sharp nod and slid into the back of the car. The heavy door closed behind her with a soft, expensive thud, sealing her off from the noise of the city and encasing her in a world of profound silence, rich leather, and the faint, clean scent of power. The man sitting across from her was Sterling Croft. In the dim interior light of the car, he seemed less like a person and more like a monument carved from granite. His face, etched with the fine lines of age and countless high-stakes decisions, was perfectly composed. His eyes, a pale, piercing blue, regarded her not with anger, but with an unnerving, almost predatory level of scrutiny. He was assessing her, weighing her, just as he had in the restaurant. There was no sign of the blustering rage his son had displayed, only an aura of absolute control, of a power so vast and ingrained that it required no performance. He was the source of the river of wealth and influence from which Julian merely drank. Ilara met his gaze without blinking, her own fear now completely subsumed by a cold, watchful curiosity. The air in the car was thick with unspoken questions, a silent battle of wills between the old lion of finance and the woman who had publicly declawed his cub. Sterling Croft did not waste time with pleasantries. His voice, when he spoke, was a low, gravelly baritone, a voice accustomed to being obeyed without question. He told her that he did not approve of his son's behavior. He called it unsophisticated and emotionally volatile, a liability in the world they inhabited. He did not apologize for it. He merely stated his assessment as a cold, hard fact. Then, he turned his attention to her. He said that her performance, on the other hand, had been the most impressive display of strategic de-escalation and intellectual dominance he had witnessed in years. He was not complimenting a waitress. He was acknowledging a peer, a player who had demonstrated an unexpected and formidable skill on the field of battle. He spoke of her command of the law, her poise under pressure, and her ability to turn a position of weakness into one of unassailable strength. He was not just impressed, he was intrigued. He then made an offer that was so audacious, so utterly unbelievable that Ilara at first thought she must have misheard him. He offered her a job, not a service job, but a senior executive position at Croft Capital. The salary he quoted was a staggering figure, more than 10 times what she made at Aura, an amount that would not only cover her father's medical bills, but would secure his care for the rest of his life. The title was Senior Vice President of Risk Management and Internal Oversight. Her primary responsibility, he explained with a chilling lack of emotion, would be to serve as a check on his son's division. She would be tasked with reviewing Julian's proposals, assessing their legal and ethical vulnerabilities, and providing direct counsel to Sterling himself. He was, in essence, offering her the position of being his son's professional warden, a handler for the reckless heir he could no longer control. To seal the offer, he reached into the breast pocket of his immaculate suit and produced a single, heavy business card. He handed it to her across the silent space of the car. Ilara took it, her fingers tracing the deeply embossed lettering. The cardstock was thick and expensive, the font a simple, elegant serif, and on it were 2 words that made the air leave her lungs and her blood run cold. Croft Capital. It was them. It was the name from the legal documents, the name that had haunted her nightmares for 3 years, the corporate entity that had acted as the executioner of her father's dream. The hostile takeover, the ruined pensions, the stroke, the endless medical bills. The source of all her family's suffering was printed on the card she now held in her hand. The universe, in its infinite and cruel irony, was offering her a seat at the table with the very monsters who had devoured her life. A wave of nausea and white-hot rage washed over her. Her first instinct was to throw the card back in his face, to scream at him, to unleash the torrent of pain and fury she had kept locked away for so long. She wanted to tell him exactly what his company had done, to show him the human cost of a transaction that was nothing more than a forgotten line item on a quarterly report for him. The name of her father's company, Innovate Dynamics, was on the tip of her tongue, a curse she was ready to hurl like a stone. But then, another thought, colder and far more strategic, cut through the emotional storm. She looked at Sterling Croft's impassive face, at the business card in her hand, and she saw not an insult, but an opportunity, an opening. He did not know who she was. He was blind to her history, seeing only her skill. He was unknowingly inviting a Trojan horse into the very heart of his empire. He was offering her access. He was offering her information. He was offering her a weapon. From the inside, she could learn everything. She could uncover the rot at the core of Croft Capital, find the evidence of other lives they had ruined, and perhaps, just perhaps, find a way to exact a justice that no courtroom could ever provide. The rage did not disappear, but it changed its form. It cooled, hardened, and sharpened itself into a single deadly point of purpose. She could take this job, this blood money, and use it to fund her father's care, while simultaneously plotting the downfall of the man sitting across from her and the son, who had just sealed his own fate. A slow, cold smile, one that did not reach her eyes, touched Alara's lips. She looked up from the business card and met Sterling Croft's gaze. Her voice, when she spoke, was as calm and steady as it had been in the restaurant. She told him she accepted his offer. The war had just begun. Alara's first day at Croft Capital was a study in profound and unsettling dissonance. Her office was located on the 89th floor, just 6 floors below the gilded cage of Aura, yet it was a universe away. The space was an exercise in minimalist power, a cavernous room with a floor-to-ceiling glass wall that offered a panoramic, godlike view of the city. The desk was a single, massive slab of polished obsidian, cool and unyielding to the touch. The air was sterile, chilled to a precise temperature, and smelled faintly of ozone from the humming servers and the subtle, expensive scent of leather from the 2 chairs that faced her desk. This was not a room for work, it was a throne room for command. As she sat in the ergonomic chair, a piece of engineering that probably cost more than her car, she felt the phantom weight of her waitress uniform, the memory of aching feet, and the constant demand for invisibility. Now she was not only visible, she was a center of gravity, a designated authority. The irony was a bitter acid in her stomach. The money that now flowed into her bank account, a sum so large it felt unreal, was already being wired to her father's care facility, ensuring his comfort and safety. She was using the spoils of the victor to heal the wounds they had inflicted, a transaction that felt both righteous and deeply profane. The initial phase of her plan was one of careful observation and assimilation. She spent the first week absorbing the culture of Croft Capital, a brutal ecosystem built on a foundation of quiet aggression and relentless ambition. She learned the language of the firm, a clipped, acronym-laden dialect that stripped all humanity from their transactions. Companies were not businesses full of people. They were undervalued assets. Employees were not human beings with families. They were redundancies, or synergistic overhead. She attended meetings where Julian presided, watching him from across the long mahogany tables. He barely acknowledged her presence, his arrogance preventing him from seeing her as anything more than a bureaucratic nuisance his father had imposed upon him. This blindness was her greatest asset. She maintained a facade of detached professionalism, her face a carefully constructed mask of neutral competence. Inside, however, her mind was a whirlwind of activity, recording every interaction, every casual remark, every flicker of weakness in Julian's armor. She was a predator learning the patterns of her prey, patiently waiting for the moment to strike. Her official role as Senior Vice President of Risk Management and Internal Oversight gave her an unprecedented level of access to the company's digital infrastructure. It was her job, as Sterling had defined it, to scrutinize the deals proposed by Julian's division. This legitimate authority was her skeleton key, allowing her to unlock doors that would have otherwise remained sealed forever. The Croft Capital servers were a digital fortress, a labyrinth of firewalls, multi-factor authentication protocols, and military-grade encryption. She spent her nights not sleeping, but mapping this virtual territory, her fingers flying across the keyboard as she navigated the complex architecture. She was searching for a ghost, a digital echo of the transaction that had destroyed Innovate Dynamics. She knew Julian, in his arrogance, would believe his digital trail was perfectly concealed, buried under layers of shell corporations and coded project names. But she also knew that true erasure was impossible. Somewhere in the billions of lines of data, a breadcrumb remained, a single thread she could pull to unravel his entire tapestry of deceit. The sheer volume of data was overwhelming, a digital ocean designed to drown any investigator in a flood of irrelevant information. For weeks, she felt like she was making no progress, her search queries returning nothing but dead ends and heavily redacted files. The frustration was a physical weight, settling in her shoulders and creating a constant, dull headache behind her eyes. During these long, fruitless nights, the image of her father would surface in her mind. She would remember him in his workshop, his face illuminated by the glow of a computer monitor, his brow furrowed in concentration as he solved some impossible coding problem. He never gave up. That memory became her fuel. She began to think like him, not as a lawyer looking for a document, but as an engineer looking for a flaw in the system. She stopped searching for the name Innovate Dynamics and started looking for patterns, for the unique financial signatures and legal maneuvers that characterized Julian's most aggressive takeovers. She was hunting for his methodology, the predatory algorithm he applied to his victims. Her first breakthrough came not from a server, but from a man. His name was Arthur Pence, a senior accountant who had been with Croft Capital for over 30 years. He was a creature of the old guard, a quiet, meticulous man who predated the firm's current era of slash-and-burn capitalism. Ilara had noticed him in meetings, his face tight with a barely concealed disapproval as Julian outlined his latest scorched earth acquisition strategy. She saw in his eyes the same weariness and moral fatigue she felt in her own soul. She approached him carefully, not with a direct accusation, but with a series of probing, professional questions about historical risk assessment protocols. She framed her inquiries as part of her new role, a desire to understand the firm's evolution. Over several carefully orchestrated conversations in the sterile company cafeteria, she built a fragile bridge of trust, speaking his language of numbers and ledgers, showing him a respect that Julian and his young acolytes never did. One evening, as the cleaning crews began their nightly rounds, Arthur appeared at the door of her office, a worn, leather-bound ledger in his hands. He didn't speak. He simply placed the book on her obsidian desk and left as silently as he had arrived. The ledger was not part of any official record. It was his private log, a meticulous hand-written chronicle of transactions that had been deliberately obscured in the official digital records. He had kept it as a form of personal insurance, a moral anchor in a sea of corruption, and in its pages, written in his elegant, spidery script, was the key she had been searching for. It was a list of internal project codes, each one corresponding to a hostile takeover that had been routed through a series of offshore shell corporations. Next to one code, Project Chimera, was a parenthetical note, Innovate Dynamics. Arthur had become her insider, the silent conspirator who had just handed her the map to the heart of the labyrinth. The code was a Rosetta Stone. Using it as a search parameter, she was able to bypass the surface-level security protocols and access a deeper, hidden layer of the server. Here, she found the raw, unfiltered data of Julian's operations. It was a graveyard of corporate entities, each one stripped, dismantled, and left for dead. But the most critical files, the ones detailing the flow of money and the final disposition of assets, were locked in a separate, heavily encrypted partition. Her corporate credentials were not enough to breach it. She had the map, but the treasure chest was sealed with a lock she could not pick. She felt a surge of frustration, so close to the truth yet held back by a wall of code. She knew she needed help, not just a key, but a guide who understood the arcane architecture of financial warfare at a level even she had not yet mastered. There was only one person she could trust with a secret of this magnitude. Professor Alistair Finch, her former mentor at Georgetown Law, was a legend in the field of corporate ethics. He was a man who saw the law not as a set of rules, but as a moral battlefield. She flew to Washington, D.C. for a single day, meeting him in his book-lined university office, the air thick with the comforting smell of old paper and leather. She laid out the situation, omitting names but providing the precise structural details of the scheme she had uncovered. Finch listened without interruption, his steepled fingers resting against his lips, his sharp eyes missing nothing. He was a man who had dedicated his life to dissecting the anatomy of corporate malfeasance, and he recognized the classic signs of a sophisticated, predatory operation designed to exploit the very edge of legality. Professor Finch did not give her a simple answer. He gave her an education. He spent 3 hours with her, drawing complex diagrams on a whiteboard, illustrating the likely flow of capital through tax havens in the Cayman Islands and Switzerland. He explained the concept of asset stripping waterfalls, a process where a target company's most valuable intellectual property and physical assets are sold off through a rapid succession of shell corporations, each transaction designed to muddy the trail and minimize tax liability. He told her what to look for: inconsistencies in valuation reports, backdated stock options for ghost employees, and wire transfers to entities with no discernible business purpose. He was not just giving her a key, he was teaching her how to think like the criminals she was hunting. He was arming her for the final battle, transforming her from a simple investigator into a forensic strategist. Returning to New York, Ilara felt a renewed sense of purpose, her mind buzzing with the strategies Finch had outlined. She attacked the encrypted server with a new methodology. She was no longer trying to break in through the front door. She was looking for the cracks in the foundation. Working late into the night, fueled by black coffee and a cold, burning rage, she began to cross-reference the data from Arthur's ledger with the fragmented files she could access. She traced wire transfers, followed the creation and dissolution of shell corporations, and pieced together the complex puzzle of Julian's financial machinations. The work was grueling and mentally exhausting. Each line of code, each legal document, was a monument to a destroyed company, a testament to ruined lives. And with every file she decrypted, the image of her father's weary face grew stronger in her mind, his silent presence, her constant companion in the sterile glow of her monitor. Finally, after a week of relentless effort, she broke through. A single line in a forgotten memo referenced a backup server used for legacy M&A data archiving. It was an old system, with less sophisticated security protocols, a digital attic where old sins were left to gather dust, and on that server she found it. The complete, unredacted folder for Project Chimera. The Innovate Dynamics file. Opening it felt like opening a tomb. Her hands trembled as she clicked through the documents. There were the internal memos celebrating the success of the takeover, the cold clinical valuation reports that systematically undervalued her father's life's work, and the strategic plans for dismantling the company, piece by piece. She saw the names of the executives who had signed off on the plan, the lawyers who had drafted the predatory contracts, and the accountants who had hidden the profits offshore. It was all there, a step-by-step blueprint for the destruction of her family. Reading the file was an act of profound and agonizing self-torture. She saw the cold calculus that had led to the dissolution of the employee pension plan, a decision dismissed in a single sentence as a necessary cost-saving measure. She saw the internal emails where Julian boasted about the speed and efficiency of the asset stripping process, referring to her father's loyal employees as, quote, dead weight. The emotional detachment, the utter lack of humanity in the documents, was more chilling than any overt act of cruelty. They hadn't just bankrupted her father, they had erased him, reducing his passion, his genius, and his legacy to a series of numbers on a spreadsheet. A single, hot tear traced a path down her cheek, falling onto the cold surface of her obsidian desk. The grief was sharp and overwhelming, but beneath it, her resolve hardened into something unbreakable, as solid and unforgiving as the desk itself. Within the Innovate Dynamics file, buried deep in an appendix of an accounting report, she found a name, Marcus Thorne, the former chief financial officer of her father's company. There was a note indicating he had been given a, quote, substantial severance package in exchange for his full cooperation and a lifetime non-disclosure agreement. This was the man who had been forced to help them dismantle the company from the inside. He was the human cost, the living proof of the damage Julian had wrought. He was the final piece of her puzzle, the validator who could give a human voice to the cold, hard data she had uncovered. Finding him became her next obsession. She knew his testimony would be the emotional core of her attack, the element that would transform her presentation from a financial analysis into a moral indictment. Julian, meanwhile, was beginning to feel the walls close in. Alara's constant requests for documentation, her probing questions in board meetings, and her uncanny ability to find the financial weak points in his proposals had put him on the defensive. He couldn't pinpoint her strategy, but he could feel her presence as a constant, unnerving pressure. He grew paranoid and irritable, lashing out at his subordinates and making increasingly reckless decisions in an attempt to push through his deals before she could block them. He began trying to conceal his activities, moving sensitive files to personal servers and communicating through encrypted messaging apps. But it was too late. He was a panicked animal trying to cover his tracks in the snow, unaware that the hunter was already watching him from above, anticipating his every move. His fear was making him sloppy, creating more and more evidence for her to find. Tracking down Marcus Thorne was not easy. After the takeover, he had vanished from the corporate world, a ghost haunted by his role in the company's demise. Alara used a private investigator, a discreet professional recommended by Professor Finch, to find him. The search ended in a small, quiet town in upstate New York, where Thorne was living a life of self-imposed exile. He was working as a high school accounting teacher, a man who had once managed a $100 million budget, now explaining basic bookkeeping to teenagers. Alara drove up on a cold Saturday morning, finding him in a modest, sparsely furnished home that smelled of regret and stale coffee. He was a ghost of the confident executive she remembered from company picnics years ago, his shoulders stooped and his eyes clouded with a deep, abiding shame. The conversation was one of the most difficult of Alara's life. At first, Thorne was terrified, his fear of the Crofts' legal power and the NDA he had signed overriding everything else. He refused to speak, his hands shaking as he clutched a mug of cold coffee. But Alara did not pressure him with legal arguments or threats. Instead, she shared her own story. She spoke of her father, of his stroke, of her years working as a waitress to pay for his care. She connected with him not as a lawyer seeking a witness, but as a fellow survivor of the same shipwreck. She showed him the file she had found, the cold documents that detailed their shared trauma. As he read the words he had been forced to authorize, his composure finally broke. He began to weep, deep, ragged sobs of a guilt he had carried alone for 3 long years. In that moment of shared grief, an alliance was forged. Alara did not ask him to break his NDA in a court of law. She offered him something else, a chance at redemption. She explained her plan for the upcoming shareholder meeting. a forum where the truth could be revealed, not to a judge, but to the very people who empowered Julian, his father and the board of directors. She promised to protect him, to use her own position within the company as a shield. She was offering him a chance to reclaim a piece of the soul he believed he had lost. After a long, heavy silence, Marcus Thorne looked at her, his eyes clear for the first time in years, and he agreed. He would provide a written, notarized statement detailing the coercion and the true devastating human impact of the Innovate Dynamics takeover. He would be her validator. Back in her silent, imposing office at Croft Capital, Ilara assembled the final pieces of her arsenal. She had the digital evidence, a clear and irrefutable trail of financial malfeasance. She had the expert analysis, a framework provided by Professor Finch that would leave no room for doubt about the illegality and recklessness of Julian's methods. She had the inside corroboration from Arthur's ledger, proving a long-standing pattern of deceit. And now she had the human testimony, a powerful and heartbreaking account from Marcus Thorne that would serve as the soul of her presentation. She spent the next 48 hours weaving these elements together into a single, devastating narrative. It was more than a report. It was a weapon, meticulously crafted and perfectly balanced. On the eve of the shareholder meeting, she stood before the glass wall of her office, looking down at the glittering expanse of New York City. The city no longer looked like an intimidating, chaotic force. It looked like a chessboard. For 3 years she had been a pawn, moved by forces beyond her control. Now she was a player, a queen with the power to topple a king. She thought of her father, not in his hospital bed, but as he was before, vibrant, brilliant, and full of life. This was for him. It was for Marcus Thorne, for Arthur Pence, for the countless other nameless employees whose lives had been shattered by the casual cruelty of men like Julian Croft. She felt no fear, no doubt. All that remained was a cold, pure, and righteous certainty. The stage was set. The evidence was gathered. The plan for the final confrontation was complete. Tomorrow, in the boardroom on the 90th floor, she would not just seek justice, she would become it. The boardroom on the 90th floor of the Atlas Tower was a temple of silent, brutal power. The air, scrubbed and chilled, carried no scent except the faint, sterile aroma of glass cleaner and the whisper of money being counted in distant, digital vaults. A single, monolithic table of dark, polished mahogany stretched the length of the room, its surface reflecting the cold, gray sky and the jagged Manhattan skyline like a black, frozen lake. Seated around it were the members of the Croft Capital Board, a collection of men and one woman whose faces were impassive masks, honed by decades of high-stakes negotiations and ruthless decisions. They were the arbiters of corporate fate, their collective gaze holding the power to create or destroy empires with a single, quiet vote. At the head of the table sat Sterling Croft, a figure of immense, gravitational stillness, his pale blue eyes missing nothing. At the opposite end, Julian stood beside a massive presentation screen, basking in the spotlight, his confidence restored, his posture a study in inherited arrogance as he prepared to unveil his latest conquest. Ilara sat halfway down the table, a picture of unassuming professionalism in a simple, dark gray suit. To the board she was a new, unknown quantity, his father's strange hire. To Julian she was a minor annoyance. To herself she was a prosecutor, and this room was her courtroom. Her heart was not racing with fear, but beating with the slow, powerful, and righteous rhythm of a drum calling a warrior to battle. Julian's presentation began with a flourish of corporate buzzwords and aggressive projections. He spoke of synergies, of leveraging undervalued assets, of a swift and decisive acquisition that would yield a 40% return on investment within 2 fiscal quarters. The target was a small, family-owned manufacturing firm in the Midwest, a company known for its innovation and its deep loyalty to its employees. As he spoke, a slide appeared on the screen behind him, filled with charts and graphs that painted a picture of ruthless efficiency. Ilara listened in silence, her hands resting calmly on the table before her, her expression unreadable. She let him build his case, let him weave his narrative of financial genius and predatory vision. She could see the subtle nods of approval from some of the board members, men of Julian's generation, who saw the world through the same lens of profit at any cost. Julian, catching her eye, gave her a look of smug, dismissive triumph, a silent challenge. He believed he was unassailable, his logic impenetrable, his power absolute. He had no idea that every word he spoke was not building his case, but tightening the noose he had unknowingly placed around his own neck. He was so focused on the future conquest that he had forgotten the ghosts of his past. When he finished, a polite, sterile silence filled the room. Sterling Croft turned his head slowly, his gaze falling upon Ilara. He did not speak a command, but his look was an invitation, a question. It was her turn. Ilara rose from her seat, her movements fluid and deliberate. She did not go to the front of the room. She remained where she was, a quiet but undeniable center of gravity. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and even, carrying the weight of absolute authority. She began not with an accusation, but with a simple, clinical analysis of Julian's numbers. With surgical precision, she dismantled his projections, pointing out the flawed assumptions in his valuation models and the undisclosed liabilities he had conveniently omitted. She spoke of long-term brand erosion, of the hidden costs of dismantling a company with deep community ties, of the reputational risk that his scorched earth tactics posed to Croft Capital itself. She was speaking their language, the cold, hard dialect of risk and return. The atmosphere in the room began to shift. The board members, who had been leaning back in their chairs, now leaned forward, their masks of polite interest replaced by expressions of sharp, focused attention. Julian's confident smirk began to falter, a flicker of irritation appearing in his eyes. Then, with the foundation of his argument reduced to rubble, Ilara made her pivot. She told the board that this reckless, value-destroying strategy was not an isolated event, but part of a well-established pattern. With a soft click of the remote in her hand, the screen behind Julian changed. His presentation vanished, replaced by a single, stark line of text: Project Chimera. A wave of confusion rippled through the board, but a flash of recognition, and then pure, unadulterated panic, crossed Julian's face. Ilara's voice never wavered as she explained that this was an internal code name for a hostile takeover executed 3 years prior, a transaction whose records had been deliberately buried. She detailed the methodology, the use of offshore shell corporations, the asset stripping, the dissolution of the pension plan, a perfect mirror of the plan he had just proposed. She laid out the financial results of that long-forgotten deal, a short-term profit for Croft Capital, followed by the complete collapse of the acquired company, and a net long-term loss when accounting for the ensuing lawsuits from creditors and the permanent destruction of valuable intellectual property. She was showing them that his supposed genius was, in fact, a repeatable formula for failure. With the entire room hanging on her every word, Ilara delivered the final devastating blow. Her voice softened slightly, losing its clinical edge and taking on a note of profound, controlled gravity. She told them the name of the company destroyed by Project Chimera. Innovate Dynamics, she said, the words hanging in the silent air. And then, she looked directly at Julian, whose face had gone completely pale, a sheen of cold sweat beading on his forehead. She revealed her full name, Ilara Vance, and she told them that the founder and chief engineer of Innovate Dynamics was her father. The revelation landed with the force of a physical impact. A collective, sharp intake of breath was audible around the table. Julian stared at her, his mouth slightly agape, his mind frantically connecting the dots: the waitress, the soup, the impossible legal knowledge, the job offer from his father. It was a conspiracy, a trap, and he had walked into it with all the blind arrogance of a king marching into an ambush. In that moment, he did not see a senior vice president. He saw the ghost of every person he had ever trampled on his path to power, and she was wearing his victim's face. Before the shock could settle, Alara pressed her advantage, her voice now imbued with the cold, righteous anger she had suppressed for so long. She projected a new document onto the screen. It was the signed, notarized statement from Marcus Thorne, the former CFO of Innovate Dynamics. She did not read it in a monotone. She gave voice to his words, her tone conveying the full weight of his shame and regret. She spoke of the coercion, the threats, the impossible position he had been put in. She painted a vivid, heartbreaking picture of the human cost of Julian's transaction, of employees who had worked their entire lives for a company only to see their retirement savings vanish overnight, of families bankrupted by the loss of their health insurance, of a community devastated by the closure of its largest employer. She concluded with Thorne's description of her father, a brilliant and kind man, being broken by the stress of watching his life's work and his people be so cruelly dismantled. The numbers on a spreadsheet had been given names and faces, and the sterile boardroom was suddenly filled with the silent, accusing screams of the lives Julian had ruined. The dam of Julian's composure finally broke. He began to sputter, his words a chaotic jumble of denials and accusations. He called her a liar, a corporate spy, claiming this was a personal vendetta, a setup. But his voice lacked conviction. It was the shrill, panicked sound of a man completely out of his depth, his armor of privilege and power stripped away to reveal the frightened, inadequate core beneath. He looked to the board for support, but their faces were cold stone, their eyes filled with a mixture of contempt and clinical assessment. They were not seeing a leader, they were seeing a liability. Finally, his desperate gaze fell upon his father, his last hope for salvation. But Sterling Croft's face was a mask of profound, icy disappointment. He looked at his son not with anger, but with the weary finality of a man who had just confirmed his deepest fears. Sterling raised a single hand, a small, quiet gesture that instantly silenced Julian's tirade. He then spoke 2 words, his gravelly voice cutting through the tension like a guillotine's blade. "You're out." The words were not a suggestion or a request. They were a verdict. The execution was swift, quiet, and absolute. Type "justice" in the comments if you got chills when Alara finally exposed the truth. What was the most satisfying moment of Julian Croft's downfall for you? Let us know in the comments below. How did that final confrontation make you feel? Share your reaction with us. In the deafening silence that followed, Sterling Croft turned his gaze back to Alara. His expression was unreadable, but his next words would redefine her future and the future of the company. He announced to the board, effective immediately, that Alara Vance would be promoted to president of the acquisitions division. He tasked her not with dismantling companies, but with identifying and investing in businesses with potential for sustainable, ethical growth. He was handing her the keys to the very kingdom his son had abused, giving her the power to transform the most predatory arm of his empire into a force for creation rather than destruction. She was no longer the Trojan horse, she was the new architect. As security discreetly escorted a shattered and defeated Julian from the room, Alara felt the full weight of the moment settle upon her. The long, impossible fight was over. She had not just won justice for her father. She had won the power to prevent the same tragedy from ever happening to anyone else. It was a victory more profound and complete than she had ever dared to imagine. Her new life began not with a celebration, but with a quiet visit. The long-term care facility was no longer a place of sterile anxiety, but a state-of-the-art rehabilitation center, its halls filled with natural light and the gentle sounds of classical music. She found her father on a sunlit terrace, a warm blanket over his lap, looking out over a garden bursting with life. He was still limited in his movement, his words still a struggle, but the vacant, defeated look in his eyes was gone. It had been replaced by a quiet, peaceful clarity. She sat with him, Not speaking of boardrooms or corporate battles, but of simple things. The changing color of the leaves, a funny story from her childhood, the progress of his physical therapy. As she spoke, he slowly reached out and took her hand, his grip surprisingly firm. He looked at her, and for the first time in 3 years, he gave her a small, clear smile. It was a smile of recognition, of pride, of a peace that had finally been restored. In that single, silent gesture, Alara found her true resolution. The money, the title, the power, they were merely tools. This moment of connection and healing with the man who had inspired her journey was the victory. Her quest for justice had brought her father back from the edge of despair, and in doing so, had finally allowed her to come home to herself. If Alara Vance's incredible journey from underdog to powerhouse inspired you, show your support by hitting that like button and sharing the story with someone who needs to see it. And for more unforgettable stories of justice and empowerment, don't forget to subscribe and ring the notification bell. If you believe that courage and truth can change the world, help us spread that message by giving this video a like and sending it to a friend. To make sure you don't miss our next story of righteous revenge, be sure to subscribe and hit the bell.